My brothers and my sisters, for just a few moments this morning, I want to talk with you from the topic, signs leading to Jesus. Signs leading to Jesus. Tomorrow, January 6th, is one of the most significant days in the entire year. It's so significant because it helps us put in symbolic perspective the fact that God often uses signs to lead people to Jesus. Tomorrow is significant, and at the Church Universal annually celebrates the Feast of the Epiphany. But even though tomorrow's significance has everything to do with the church, tomorrow's symbolism is evidenced by both secular and sacred practices. Let me give you two examples of what I mean. Now, from my time growing up as a boy in New Orleans, there are certain things that still are special to me in my adulthood because those things continue to mean so much in my life. I can remember, for example, in downtown New Orleans, as the Superdome was being constructed, I remember all of the cranes. To this day, even through the lean years, the time when people wore paper bags over their heads and labeled them the Aints, but especially now that New Orleans is a perennial Super Bowl contender as the New Orleans Saints, I'm a card-carrying member of the Who Dat Nation. And you can trust and believe in just about an hour, I'm going to be somewhere screaming, Who Dat? Also from my childhood, I can remember my mother teaching me how to make gumbo. That's a practice that's very special to my family, and it's something I still love to share with my wife and children today. Most importantly, however, as it relates to the significance of tomorrow, of January 6th, I can still remember being in elementary school and marking the day as what we called Three Kings Day. It was the kickoff to the carnival season. And the children in our class would rotate week to week, determining who was going to bring the next king cake to school. Now, king cakes are decorated with the wonderful tasty frosting in the carnival colors of purple, gold, and green, and they would have a tiny toy replica of a baby, a sign leading to Jesus, inside of them. And whoever found the baby was responsible the next week to bring the king cake to class. Now, you can trust and believe, as much as I still scream, Who Dat today as a man, I look forward to every Friday in elementary school during carnival season when I was a boy, because I sure enough loved to eat king cake. I guess what I'm trying to say, though, is that more so than my mother's gumbo, even more so than being a member of the Who Dat Nation, my most precious memories as a child came from a secular environment where signs led me to Jesus. Now, in the sacred context, tomorrow begins a season where, as a pastor, I am even more so reminded about signs leading to Jesus. Because January 6th is the official commencement of the carnival season, it reminds me, quite frankly, of the undercurrent of religion that exists in the world. Meaning, regardless of whether we're talking about carnival parades and public parties in Panama City, Panama, maybe in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, or even in my back home, or my hometown, rather, back home of New Orleans, Louisiana, this season of fanfare and frolic culminates with what I call Mardi Gras. That is a French term translated to mean Fat Tuesday. It's nothing more than a cycle that culminates with a period of abstinence beginning that next day on Ash Wednesday. In other words, the entire carnival season, beginning tomorrow, is a time of joyous preparation as we look forward to the penitent liturgical season of Lent, another sign leading to Jesus. Now, I'm a grown man and I can think back about aspects of my childhood with fondness, but I also recognize the importance of my faith in beginning a new year. So as I ponder the challenges of my past, I also expect God's blessings on my present and my future. I now realize that God can use all types of signs to bring people closer to Jesus. God can use occurrences, and God can also use obstacles. God can use events, and God can use our mishaps. God can use a star, but God can also use people, all to lead somebody to Jesus. As we worship together this morning on this first Sunday of a new year and a new decade, I ask you, look deep inside yourself introspectively and ponder. What signs are God putting before you? How is God trying to speak to you? And how is God trying to lead you to Jesus? When we look at this text now, we are preaching this morning on the day just prior to the celebration of the Epiphany, and we're preaching from one of the most popular stories in the entire Holy Bible. This is the story of the wise men, also known as the Magi, following a sign that led them to Jesus. Now, this story, uniquely appearing in Matthew's gospel, sets the tone for the rule of a newborn king. But it also asks us to look deep inside ourselves in a very non-conventional sense and ask, what signs lead us to Jesus? You may recall that in preaching on the last Sunday of Advent, the Sunday when we focused on love, I shared with you from Matthew's first chapter, recordation of the story of the Annunciation, that neither Mary or Joseph had a voice. Although Joseph had a choice, neither Mary or Joseph had a speaking role in the first chapter of Matthew. In fact, the only voices we heard in Matthew's first chapter were from the narrator and from an unnamed angel. Now, however, in picking up in chapter 2, the first human voice we hear in Matthew's gospel comes from the wise men when they ask the question, where? And that where creates for us a tension in the text because it has everything to do not just with the answer to the question, but it also has to do with who is asking the question. Now, this tension in the text is based on class and based on socioeconomic standing. In answering the question, where is the King of the Jews? Verse 6 tells us that the chief priests and the scribes, those who were well schooled in the Jewish law, referenced the old Hebrew scriptures and shared that the child was born in Bethlehem. Watch this, a place that should not be regarded as any less than any place else. In other words, if we were to define, quote unquote, Bethlehem in our current day geographic context here in Durham, North Carolina, someone came to town, they may ask, where can I find this precious treasure? Would it be in the divinely designed Duke Chapel? No, but you might find it in the hood down in Hayti here on this side of town. Well, where can I find this flagrant flower? Surely it's over in Duke Gardens. No, but you might find it on the backside of campus by the parking lot over here at NCCU. What I'm trying to say is that in answering the question where, Matthew shows us that God can use some non-conventional signs to lead us to Jesus. Now, this tension in the text is not just based on the question that's asked, it's also based on who is asking and who is answering the question too. The text tells us that the question was asked by the wise men, or the Magi, a term that comes from the Greek denoting an astrologer or a magician, someone who studies stars. These well-to-do Persian astrologers who were carrying with them the gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh, gold to represent royalty, frankincense to represent divinity, and myrrh to represent mortality, posed their question to the chief priest. In other words, the most high-up muckety-mucks in Herod's socioeconomic class. By then following this star, some say it was a meteorite, some say it was a comet, some say it was an angel. But by following this star, these well-to-do Persian astrologers were led to find Jesus down the most unlikely path. They were led from Herod's palace to a makeshift manger because Joseph the carpenter, didn't have the right socioeconomic pedigree or the right amount of cash to get his family a room. What I'm trying to say is that when it comes to signs God might use to lead us to Jesus, God moves in mysterious ways. Now, just like there's a tension in this text based on socioeconomic class, there is also a tension in our time. And that tension is based on what we often call the haves and the have-nots. All we have to do is remember that whether you have or have not, God will always give signs that lead you to Jesus. Let me give you an example of what I mean. Now, I was with my wife and children just last week as we were at a rooftop infinity pool overlooking Panama City when I got a news story that made it seem like the bottom fell out back here at the ranch. I got on my phone and I started emailing some folks, and the response I got was that, Pastor, we got it under control. Go back and enjoy your vacation. We've already taken some measures and we have a plan underway. Now, I took that person at face value, but I'm still a pastor. So I got down and I started praying on my knees. Not only did God answer my prayers, but God did exceedingly. God did abundantly. God showed that God is able, and God turned a frown upside down. God turned what otherwise would have been lemons, and God turned them into lemonade. Oh, it was on Christmas Eve that I saw God use not just obstacles and occurrences, not just events and mishaps, but most importantly, I saw God use the people of this church as living signs to bring somebody closer to Jesus, What I'm trying to say is that although the story that aired on WRAL was all about the toys that the young people were going to receive on Christmas Eve, the real story was that people gave of themselves after an email was sent out at 2-something in the afternoon to leave their houses on Christmas Eve and go do something for somebody they never met. What I'm trying to say is that God showed up and God showed out. God flipped the script and God turned a frown upside down. God showed up through the WRL news story, and although Jesus may have been born in a manger, God showed us that Jesus is alive and well because Jesus is living in your heart. God used this congregation as a human sign to bring people closer to Jesus. Oh, I wonder how else God will show up and show out in 2020. How else will God show up and show out in your life if you're willing to open yourself up to new possibilities and new opportunities, and you're willing to recognize that God still moves in mysterious ways, And God can still use unexpected signs to bring somebody closer to Jesus. Maybe God will use good times. Maybe God will use bad times too. Maybe God can use a planned occurrence, or maybe God can use a misstep and a mishap. But God can always turn a frown upside down because God is able, all by God's self, to make a way out of no way like only God can. Somehow, if only you're willing to open your eyes here in 2020 and recognize that God can truly use you to lead somebody to Jesus. Now, just like there's a tension in this text, we also see God's grace in this text. We see God's grace in this text because you too have been down some unlikely paths over the course of your life. And you, too, may have had to deal with what seems like obstacles that were placed in your way. But if you're willing to follow signs leading to Jesus, you will be blessed with overwhelming joy. When we look at the text now, again in verse 10, after following this star, this angel, this occurrence, this unlikely sign, these wise men were overwhelmed with joy. Now, I wonder if there anybody here who's a little bit like this wise man, and that you too have followed some unlikely signs in your life, and you too had to deal with something you thought was a setback, but you really realized that it was a set up from God to bring you to a place where you would have overwhelming joy. Oh, I wonder now if we called a roll here at St. Joseph AME Church this morning, if anybody else aside these wise men has felt like they've been led with some strange signs, but it's brought them to a place where they were closer to Jesus. Maybe you didn't get the promotion you thought you wanted on your job, but God was giving you a sign that there's a better job, that there's a better opportunity, and this other opportunity would bring you a whole bunch of joy. Maybe you had to leave an unhealthy or an unhappy relationship only to realize the blessing that God had in store for you down the road because you couldn't begin to see it when you were wrapped up in the confines of your situation. Maybe God has taken you through some tough times. Maybe God has taken you through some horrible days. Maybe God has taken you through some things just to humble you because you needed to realize we all need God to make it through this thing called life. Oh, even though God has always moved in mysterious ways, you don't have to be a Persian astrologer to know that regardless of what you've been through in the past, God is still able. God is still a deliverer. God is still a conqueror. God is still a healer. God is still a provider. And what I'm trying to say is that there's grace in this text because if you're willing to look, there always will be an unexpected sign that leads you to Jesus. If you're willing to follow God's signs, you will be blessed with overwhelming joy. That just like we see God's grace in this text, we also see God's grace in our lives. In following signs leading to Jesus, God will use us to break down barriers based on race. God will use us to break down barriers based on class. And in following signs leading to Jesus, we're able to focus much more so on the inward blessings that you can't see instead of the materialistic blessings that you otherwise can see, Only if you're willing to follow signs that will truly lead you to Jesus. Following signs leading to Jesus allows us to change our perspective, especially in entering a new year. It allows us to recognize that regardless of what challenges you may have had in the past, if you're able to look past conventional conceptualizations in adverse situations, you can actually have a divine encounter with Jesus and have overwhelming joy. What I'm trying to say is that as we begin a new year with new possibilities, are you willing to learn from the past but make a commitment here in 2020 to have perfect vision when it comes to using God and allowing God to use you in the most non-conventional ways? Oh, I want to follow signs leading to Jesus because I want to be in a place where I'm more intimate, I'm more deliberate, I'm more prayerful, I'm more Bible reading, I'm more contemplative, and I've got a much more deliberate relationship with God. I'm willing to follow signs leading to Jesus. I want to close out this first sermon of this new year and this new decade by sharing with you a personal story that has everything to do with following non-conventional signs that lead to Jesus. Now, I begin by telling you about some joyous experiences for me, some joyous signs that led me to Jesus in the form of king cake. That's back when I was in elementary school. I thank God for the foundation of a young boy who found comfort and who found joy in running to Jesus because I needed that by the time I got to high school. I went to an all-boys, all-black Catholic high school in New Orleans, and I found myself just about every day going to Mass and praying with the priests, praying for myself, but praying that God would protect my mother because of a domestic situation that was going on in my home. God must have used the foundation of happiness and those signs that I got at the king cake because God brought me to a place of solace dealing with Jesus when I was in high school. Now, I can also remember playing basketball or trying to play basketball just like I try to sing, right? I can remember that God sent a sign because I was cut from the varsity basketball team. My mother said, you can't just come home every day now. You got to find something to do after school. So I joined St. Augustine High School's speech and debate team. When I graduated in 1989, God blessed me not just to be co-captain of the speech and debate team, but to also be named one of the best orators in the state of Louisiana. St. Aug's speech and debate team set a foundation for me when I went to Howard, when I joined the speech and debate team there. And again, I was looking for a sign leading to Jesus. The moderator of Howard's speech and debate team was an AME minister. You've met her, the Reverend Dr. Dubai Sababu Thomas, who preached here for our Family and Friends Day celebration. Because God took me on that path with signs leading to Jesus, I was able to be mentored by Dr. Thomas, and I joined the AME Church. Now, I'm not saying that everybody here is necessarily called on to serve an ordained ministry, but I am saying that everybody here in the new year ought to be wanting to follow signs that will lead them to a closer relationship with God. Are you willing to look beyond traditional confines? Are you willing to follow the signs that God is putting in your life and have a closer relationship with Jesus?